Herzlich willkommen, mein Name ist Walter Gront. Ich darf Sie im Namen des Teams der Europäischen Literaturtage und im Namen des Hauptverbands des Österreichischen Buchhandels zu dieser Sonntagsmatinee zu Ehren des britischen Autors und Völkerrechtsanwalts Philippe Sands begrüßen. Ich begrüße alle Gäste hier im Klangraum Krems Minoritenkirche und ich begrüße alle Gäste, die über Video-Livestream mit dabei sind. Auf diese feierliche Matinee eingestimmt hat uns das Duo Sonoma. Sie hörten Sara Gregorič an der Gitarre und Mira Gregorič an der Violine. Die beiden aus Kärnten stammenden Schwestern verbinden verschiedene Musikgenres, von Klassik, Tango, Jazz bis zur neuen Musik. Seit ihrem Debüt 2021 überraschen sie mit sympathisch eigenwilligen Interpretationen und Auslegungen von Kammermusik. Seit 2017 wird der Ehrenpreis des Österreichischen Buchhandels für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln im Rahmen der Europäischen Literaturtage überreicht. Auch die heutige Ehrung von Philippe Sands findet in Kooperation mit dem Hauptverband des Buchhandels statt. Dafür allen Repräsentantinnen und Repräsentanten des Buchhandels, die heute unter uns sind, ein herzliches Danke, stellvertretend für alle willkommen. Benedikt Vöger, den Präsidenten, Alexander Bottiker, den Vizepräsidenten und Gustav Sucek, den Geschäftsführer des Hauptverbands. Vor allem ein herzliches Willkommen Philippe Sands, dem dieser Vormittag gilt. Willkommen Ernst Strouhal, der die Laudatio halten wird. Willkommen Rosie Goldsmith, die mit Philippe Sands ein Gespräch führen wird. Ein großes Danke an die Stadt Krems und ihrem Bürgermeister Dr. Reinhard Resch für den Empfang, für Wein und Brot, den es dann im Anschluss an diese Matinee geben wird. In seiner Vertretung ist Frau Gemeinderat Elisabeth Kreuzhuber unter uns, auch dafür herzliches Danke und willkommen. Und zuletzt noch ein Danke an Albert Hosp und das Festival Glatt und Verkehrt für das Musikprogramm des heutigen Vormittags. Ich bitte nun Benedikt Vöger, den Präsidenten des Hauptverbands des Buchhandels, auf die Bühne und um seine Ausführungen zu diesem großen Ehrenpreis.
Nachdem alle Ehrengäste schon so formvollendet begrüßt werden, sehr geehrte Festgäste, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren und vor allem lieber Walter Grond und herzlichen Dank, dass wir das jetzt schon seit 2017 miteinander machen dürfen. Wir leben in einer Zeit, von der ich nicht geglaubt habe, sie erleben zu müssen, sagte Salman Rushdie vor knapp einem Monat, als er den Friedenspreis des Deutschen Buchhandels in der Paulskirche in Frankfurt entgegennahm. Und weiter, in einer Zeit, in der die Freiheit, insbesondere die Meinungsfreiheit, ohne die es die Welt der Bücher nicht gäbe, auf allen Seiten von reaktionären, autoritären, populistischen, demagogischen, halbgebildeten, narzisstischen und achtlosen Stimmen angegriffen wird. Als wir im März dieses Jahres Philippe Sands diesen Preis zuerkannt haben, war die Welt tatsächlich noch eine andere und unsere Entscheidung hätte richtiger nicht sein können. Ich habe überlegt, aus dem gestrigen Interview, das seit heute online ist, aus dem Standard, das Klaus Daschwer mit Philippe Sands geführt hat, zu zitieren, aber es ist alles notwendig zu lesen und vorzulesen und das werde ich nicht tun, deshalb empfehle ich Ihnen, lesen Sie dieses Interview und Sie wissen, was ich meine, warum wir hier wirklich den würdigsten aller möglichen Preisträger gefunden haben. Es ist kein Zufall, dass die beiden wichtigsten Auszeichnungen, die die deutschsprachige Buchbranche zu vergeben hat, der Friedenspreis des Deutschen Buchhandels und der Ehrenpreis des Österreichischen Buchhandels für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln heißen. Mit diesen Preisen wollen wir als Buchbranche darauf aufmerksam machen, dass es uns um mehr geht, als nur Bücher zu verkaufen, dass wir uns unserer gesellschaftlichen Verantwortung bewusst sind und diese auch wahrnehmen. Frieden und Toleranz sind die gesellschaftlichen Eckpfeiler, auf denen jeder intellektuelle Diskurs, auf denen jede Schaffung und Auseinandersetzung mit Kunst, in unserem Fall in Form von Literatur, fußt. Es ist das erste Anliegen jedes Verlegers, aufzuklären, zu informieren und zu vermitteln. Und gerade um die Fundamente seiner Arbeit und Rezeption, den Frieden und die Toleranz zu stärken. Und seit gestern habe ich ja auch erfahren, und wir haben vorhin darüber gesprochen, dass auch der Schwiegervater von Philippe Sands Verleger ist, also er weiß ja, wovon wir sprechen, Verleger war. Es ist die ureigenste Eigenschaft des Verlegers und des Buchhändlers, an die Utopie einer gerechten und friedlichen Welt im Zeichen der Toleranz in Denken und Handeln zu glauben. Die Toleranz einer Gesellschaft zeigt sich in ihrer Kultur. Kultur ist kein Luxus, sondern Kultur begründet die Identität einer Gesellschaft, begründet deren Selbstverständnis und bildet die Grundlage für den Umgang mit anderen Gesellschaften. Der Hauptverband des Österreichischen Buchhandels verleiht dem diesjährigen Ehrenpreis des Österreichischen Buchhandels für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln an Philippe Sands. Dieser Preis wird seit 1990 jährlich an eine europäische Autorin, einen europäischen Autor verliehen, der oder die sich durch ihr Leben und Werk für die Verständigung in Europa herausragende Verdienste erworben haben. Es geht also nicht, auch hier und heute nicht, um ein einzelnes Buch, sondern um ein Lebenswerk. Grundlage für die Preiswürdigkeit der Auszuzeichnenden ist sein oder ihr Bemühen als Mensch und Autor gegenüber dem anderssprachigen und kulturell anders geprägten Nachbarn Toleranz zu üben. Zuletzt erhielten den Preis Ilya Trojanov, Francesca Melandri, A.L. Kennedy, Navid Kermani und Miljenko Jagovic. Ich persönlich durfte den Preis bislang 10-mal vergeben, aber die heutige Ehrung ist auch für mich etwas ganz Besonderes. Die Würdigung des Preisträgers wird nun Ernst Strouhal vornehmen. Herzlichen Dank.
Bitte. Die Laudatio für Philippe Sands hält Ernst Strouhal. Er ist Professor an der Universität für angewandte Kunst in Wien, Autor und Publizist. Von ihm zuletzt erschienen ist das vielbeachtete Buch 4 Schwestern, fernes Wien, fremde Welt.
Ja, vielen Dank für diese ehrende Einladung, hier vor Ihnen sprechen zu dürfen. Sehr geehrte Festgäste, lieber Philippe Sands und lieber Benedikt Vöger. Herr Vöger, eigentlich sollte ich Ihnen ja böse sein. Als Sie mich vor ein paar Monaten gefragt haben, ob ich hier zum Werk von Philippe Sands sprechen will, habe ich ohne Bedenken zugesagt, das ist nicht nur eine große Ehre, sondern ja auch eine große Freude. Ich kenne die Schriften von Philippe Sands und seine Bücher seit langer Zeit und ich bewundere sie aus vielerlei Gründen. Als ich jedoch vor ein paar Tagen nachfragte, wie lange ich denn sprechen dürfte und ich zur Antwort bekam, so 12 Minuten, da war ich Ihnen böse. Wie soll ich, lieber Herr Vöger, in so 12 Minuten erklären, was mich in den Werken und am Wirken von Philippe Sands bewegt? Das ist eine ganz und gar unmögliche Aufgabe. Das Beste wäre es, dachte ich mir, gemäß der magischen Landkarte von Louis Borges, die ident wird mit der Wirklichkeit, eine Wagenladung voller Bücher, Filme und Schriften von Sands an Sie hier alle zu verteilen und Ihnen anschließend großartige Tage bei einer großartigen Lektüre zu wünschen. Da dieser Ausweg aber mit größter Wahrscheinlichkeit durch die Knausrigkeit des Veranstalters verstellt ist und die allermeisten von Ihnen ja die Bücher von Philippe Sands kennen, möchte ich mich auf einen einzigen Aspekt im Werk von Sands konzentrieren. Er ist seltsamerweise in vielen Würdigungen und in vielen Besprechungen seiner Werke, wie gestern von Klaus Taschwer, ein wenig vernachlässigt worden. Er scheint mir aber im aktuellen politischen Diskurs, auf den auch Benedikt Vöger hingewiesen hat, nicht unwichtig. Ich möchte im Folgenden auf den brillanten Erzähler Philippe Sands und sein Engagement für Sprache und die Formen von Vermittlung aufmerksam machen. Demokratie ist bekanntlich nicht bloß Meinungsäußerung, sondern Meinungsbildung. Und diese Bildung von Meinung ist nicht nur eine Sache der Inhalte, sondern auch und im Besonderen eine Sache der Form. Es geht darum, wie wir über komplexe und kontroverse Inhalte, Sachverhalte zu sprechen in der Lage sind. Sands Werke sind meines Erachtens auch in dieser Frage besonders wertvoll. In The Red Line erzählt Sands von Otto von Wächter, einem österreichischen Nazi erster Stunde, Gouverneur des Distrikts Krakau und Galizien, Mitschuldiger am Holocaust, und er erzählt von seinem 1939 geborenen Sohn. Sands besucht ihn häufig, führt mit ihm über Jahre geduldige Gespräche. Ob sie engelsgleich sind, diese Gespräche, oder doch ein klein teuflisches Element haben, weiß ich nicht. Jedenfalls ist seine Geduld heroisch. Trotz aller Evidenz der Verbrechen seines Vaters ist er nicht zu überzeugen, dass dieser sein Vater ein Verbrecher war. Sands schafft in seinem Buch mehrfache Doppelbelichtungen. Auf einigen ist er selbst mit im Bild. Sie zeigen den Erzähler bei seinen Begegnungen mit Wächters Sohn und bei seinen peniblen historischen Recherchen. Auf einer anderen Seite wird die Biografie des Vaters von seinem frühen illegalen Nazi-Engagement in den 20er Jahren bis zu seinem rätselhaften Tod 1949 in Rom nachvollzogen. Auf einer dritten narrativen Ebene konfrontiert Sands den Sohn Wächters mit Niklas Frank, dem Sohn von Hans Frank, Generalgouverneur von Polen und 1946 als Massenmörder und Kriegsverbrecher hingerichtet. Niklas Frank hat sich der Figur seines Vaters in einem schwierigen Prozess der Distanzierung gestellt. Sie führte schließlich zur radikalen, ja wüsten Ablehnung des Vaters. Beide Söhne sind sich in gewisser Weise ähnlich wie Doppelgänger, und doch sind sie grundverschieden. Die Gegenüberstellung erzeugt Spannung, sie charakterisiert zugleich zwei Grundtypen des österreichischen Umgangs mit dem Holocaust. Geschichtsverneinung und Geschichtsvergessenheit auf der einen Seite und auf der anderen das Bewusstsein einer Herkunft, die nicht vaterlos war, sondern in der die Väter mitunter Verbrecher waren. Dieser Prozess des Bewusstwerdens war in Österreich bekanntlich ein schmerzhafter, unheimlicher Prozess, und er ist es noch. Eine vollständige Immunisierung gegenüber dem Erbe der Täter ist nicht eingetreten. Gerade hier und in diesem Bundesland wird dies in einer Koalition gerade deutlich. The Red Line versammelt unheimliche Begegnungen mit Lebenden und mit Toten und mit den lebendig Toten der Geschichte. Unheimlich sind die Begegnungen im klassischen freudschen Sinn. Das Unheimliche ist bei Freud bekanntlich mehrdeutig. Es ist das Nicht-Heimelige, das, was nicht dem Heim bzw. der Heimat zugehörig ist. Zugleich ist das Unheimliche auch etwas, was nicht mehr heimlich ist, was mal heimlich war, im Verborgenen geschah und nun wiederkehrt. Genau dieses Unheimliche der Heimat erfasst Sands in seinem zwischen Gegenwart und Vergangenheit schwankenden Blick mit äußerster Präzision. Bereits im ersten Kapitel findet sich, finde ich, einen zentralen programmatischen Satz, der mich quer durch sein Buch begleitet. Es kommt, schreibt Sands, auf die Details an. Zentral ist der Satz von den Details und ihrer Bedeutung für mich, weil er für alle Literatur gilt. In der Kunst gibt es keine Nebensachen, nichts Nebensächliches. Alle Details sind Hauptsachen. Und nur durch ihre Beachtung können wir vorgeformten Wahrnehmungen und ideologischen Mustern, die unseren Blick auf die Wirklichkeit trüben, entgehen. Dass der Autor auch Jurist ist hilfreich. Man lernt in dieser Schule, die auch Albert Drach, Ferdinand von Schirach und Franz Kafka besucht haben, klar zu denken und präzise zu formulieren. Stendhal soll jeden Morgen, begeistert von der Klarheit des Stils im Code Napoleon, also im Code Civil, nachgelesen haben, um sich in sein Tagwerk einzuschwingen. Ob derartige Stilübungen auch heute noch mit der niederösterreichischen Bauordnung oder dem allgemeinen Sozialversicherungsgesetz möglich sind, bezweifle ich. Aber bei Sands ist diese Verbindung von Jurisprudenz und Literatur jedenfalls produktiv und Grundlage einer seiner Poesie der Sachlichkeit. Sachlichkeit ist ein kostbares Gut angesichts der aktuellen Situation, angesichts des seit John Locke bestehenden unauflöslichen Paradoxons der Toleranz. Wir müssen ja in einer Demokratie bis zu einem gewissen Grad Gruppen tolerieren, die der Toleranz selbst feindlich gegenüberstehen. Wie gesagt, bis zu einem gewissen Grad. Die präzise Sprache des Rechts ist bei dieser Grenzziehung unser wichtigstes, vielleicht das einzige Instrument der Orientierung. Neuerdings werden zudem Stimmen laut, die den Begriff der Toleranz selbst angreifen. Ich glaube, das heißt heute dekonstruieren. Der Universalismus der Aufklärung, Liberalismus und das Konzept der Toleranz seien Agenten, die den Westen aufwerten. Der Westen gibt sich via Toleranz bloß den Anschein, die Vorzüge der liberalen Demokratie weiterzugeben. In Wahrheit geht es bloß um Macht und ihre Erhaltung. Tatsächlich besteht zwischen den Tolerierenden und den Tolerierten stets ein Machtgefälle. Die Tolerierenden agieren stets aus einer superioren Position, blicken in gewissem Sinn auf die Tolerierten hinab und werten sich dadurch selbst auf. Dem Gefälle der Macht entgeht man nicht. Allerdings besteht deshalb meines Erachtens nach kein Anlass, den Begriff der Toleranz zu überborden. Man kann sich des Gefälles bewusst werden und darauf achten, dass die Mittel und Ziele der Aufklärung in eine transparente Logik des rechtlichen Verfahrens eingebettet werden. Wie diese Logik funktioniert, zeigt uns Sands in einem anderen bedeutenden Werk auf eindrucksvolle Weise. In The Last Colony erzählt er entlang der Biografie einer Bewohnerin der Chagos-Inseln im Indischen Ozean, Lysabi Elysée, vom jahrzehntelangen Kampf um die Durchsetzung der Menschenrechte. Im Fall der Bewohnerinnen und der Bewohner der Inseln ist es der Kampf um Selbstbestimmung und um die Rückkehr nach ihrer widerrechtlichen Deportation zu Beginn der 1970er Jahre. Entlang ihrer Geschichte zeigt Sands die Geschichte des Völkerrechts und das Funktionieren seiner Institutionen. Sie reicht von der Charta der Vereinten Nationen in den 40er Jahren über die grundlegenden Resolutionen der Dekolonialisierung in den 1960ern bis zu den wegweisenden Beschlüssen zum Recht auf Selbstbestimmung der Völker und zum internationalen Strafrecht in der Gegenwart. Sands erzählt uns dabei keine lineare Geschichte des Fortschritts, sondern die Geschichte eines Kampfes und eines Ringens um Details. Die abstrakte Logik des internationalen Rechts und seiner Institutionen ist nicht einfach zu verstehen, aber über die Geschichte der Madame Elysée auf den einsamen Inseln im Indischen Ozean gelingt ihm ein bedeutender Beitrag zur Vermittlung der epochalen Bedeutung dieses Kampfes. Natürlich ist sich Sands der Grenzen und Gefahren des Erzählens bewusst. Unreflektiert führt das Erzählen zu einer Polarisierung durch Emotionalisierung oder kann dazu führen. Nicht Empathiemangel ist heute das Problem, sondern ein ungelenkter Überschuss an Emotionen, in dem alles jederzeit zur Haltung, jede Wortmeldung in Permanenz zur Meinung über alles wird, die Betrachtung finden soll. Der aufgeklärte Diskurs mündet statt in Verständnis gegenwärtig in eine opake Massenschlägerei um Aufmerksamkeit. Das Ergebnis ist eine semantische Sauce, die, nicht zuletzt von Philosophinnen und Philosophen, so lange verrührt wird, bis sogar wie jüngst Massenvergewaltigungen und Völkermord als ein mehr oder minder legitimer Akt in einem Befreiungskampf erscheinen können. Dagegen hält Sands die klare Benennung von Sachverhalten und die kunstvolle Einhegung des Narrativen. Es gelingt ihm, seine Geschichte in klare Argumente münden zu lassen und Anschaulichkeit dort zu erzeugen, ohne Komplexität zu reduzieren. Dieser Vorgang ist schwierig, aber in der aktuellen Krise der liberalen Demokratie meines Erachtens notwendiger denn je. Der Autor und Anwalt Philippe Sands ist ein Weltbürger, der sich in die Agendas des Staatsbürgers einmischt. Ein Citoyen im klassischen Sinn der Aufklärung. Streitbar, mit klarer Stimme sich artikulierend und einer, der im Zusammenwirken seiner unterschiedlichen Talente Zusammenhänge erzählbar und damit für uns verstehbar macht. Für ihre Erzählkunst, für ihr Engagement, für ihre Klarheit und die Anschaulichkeit der Darstellung möchte ich mich heute bei Ihnen, lieber Philippe Sands, im Namen vieler bedanken. Und Ihnen, Herr Vöger, bin ich nicht böse, also nicht sehr. Danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Es folgt nun die Verleihung des Ehrenpreises. Ich bitte Philippe Sands und Benedikt Vöger auf die Bühne. Wir bleiben einfach am Rand da. Wir zwei. Hi, alle.
Der Hauptverband des Österreichischen Buchhandels verleiht Philippe Sands den Ehrenpreis des Österreichischen Buchhandels für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln. Philippe Sands gehört fraglos zu den weltweit herausragendsten Juristen und Intellektuellen, die den gesellschaftlichen Diskurs bestimmen und sich für eine bessere Welt einsetzen. Als Autor hat er mit zahlreichen Fachbüchern zum Völkerrecht ebenso wie mit seinen zeitgeschichtlichen Werken ein großes Publikum erreicht und bewiesen, dass faktentreue und präzises Denken kein Gegensatz zu inhaltlichem Engagement, sondern das nützlichste Instrumente sind. Seine in mehrere Sprachen übersetzten Werke richten sich gegen Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit, Folter und Genozide, unabhängig davon, ob sie in der Vergangenheit oder in unserer Gegenwart stattfinden. Hauptverband des Österreichischen Buchhandels in Krems an der Donau, 19. November 2023. Herzlichen Glückwunsch.
Danke. Danke. Vielen Dank. Das wurde gut.
Es folgen nun die Dankesworte von Philippe Sands.
Well, Entschuldigung, dass ich nicht in Deutsch spreche. I'm going to speak in English. It's much easier for me. I am very deeply honored to be with you, and I want to thank the President for, on behalf of his entire team, for bestowing this award upon me, Laudatio for his really very generous words that I appreciated very much indeed. I have had a life in the law, and I've obviously moved into a different direction. And there's always been a part of me that feels, as a writer, slightly an imposter. But I have to say it is with great happiness that I'm here. You will be aware, I think, many of you, that at a personal level, this is a really significant moment for me. I have a particular relationship with this country, with Austria. Circumstances, of course, in a historical sense, which led first my grandfather, then my mother, and then my grandmother to leave between 1939 and 1941. I tell that story in Rückkehr nach Lemberg, east-west street, when I discovered details that I had not previously known about. And I think, in a sense, I have to dedicate this moment to those who are not here today and who I never had a chance to know, or even, to be honest, growing up as a child in London, ever hear about, because my mother and my grandfather, for perfectly understandable reasons, never wanted really to put a spotlight on what had happened in that period. I'm thinking in particular of my great-grandmother, Amalia Flaschner, born in Żółkiew in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, lived in Vienna, died in Treblinka. Or my mother's cousin, Herta Rosenblum, who was a 13-year-old girl in the summer of 1939 who was taken to the Westbahnhof in Vienna with my mother to be accompanied by a remarkable evangelical Christian missionary, Miss Elsie Tilney, to safety in Paris. But the little girl of 13 decided that she couldn't bear to be separated from her mother, and so remained, and of course perished 3 years later in Lodz. So, in a sense, your decision is a kind of return for me. I've been many times to Austria and to Vienna, although I'm so very happy to be here in Krems for the first time. And I have to say, it feels, in a sense, like an embrace in 2 directions. It is, to be frank, never entirely without nuance or complexity for me to be in Vienna and in Austria. But I feel your embrace, and I embrace you in return, because I have a deep connection with this country. It is a place that courses through my veins, and I have no doubt that my Austrianness in some ways influences what I do and what I write. And at this very difficult moment in the world, I think we all feel that, where tolerance is so important. This moment for me personally is as though a line has been drawn. There was the past in my relationship with Austria, and there is the future going forward. And that is a very wonderful thing. In writing the books that you've been so generous in honoring, I've benefited greatly from the assistance of many wonderful people in Austria, in Vienna, but also beyond. I've encountered always, or almost always, an openness, a willingness to engage, and I have to say I've found that so very gratifying. Some of the people with whom I've engaged are present today. One of them is Horst Wächter, to whom I express my deep gratitude for his openness and for his generosity in making ideas and information available to me for what became Die Rattenlinie. But also to my dear friends Magdalena Friederike Wächter and Galeb Stanfel, who are here today. It means a great deal to me that you are here and that we are here together. We share a complex past, and yet we are bonded, and that is important. My writing is deeply inspired by my relationship to the law, and in particular, to that moment in 1945, a revolutionary moment, when countries came together and agreed, as a matter of principle, that no more would the power of the state be unlimited, that there would be limits on what the sovereign can do. And all of my writing is informed by that, whether it's The Last Colony or Rückkehr nach Lemberg or Die Rattenlinie. The idea that the individual has rights, the idea that the group has rights, that is the essence of a tolerant society under the protective embrace of the idea and the ideal of a rule of law. But today, again, we sense the world is in real trouble. We can feel it, frankly, hurtling towards even greater disasters as issues of xenophobia, nationalism, survival, populism come to the fore. In my daily life, aside from the writing life, my other job, so to speak, whether I'm working on Chagos, on Ukraine and Russia, on Israel and Gaza, or a myriad of other things, I find myself constantly going back to that 1945 moment and to the idea of those two remarkable characters, Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, always to try to ask myself the question, how do others see the situation in which we find ourselves? To put ourselves in the situation of the other is, for me, the essence of tolerance. To be able to empathize, but also to draw lines and to recognize that there are certain lines that must never be crossed. I'm honored to receive this award. I received one earlier a few days ago in Spain, and I've decided to join together the prizes and make available the totality of the amounts that are given to me to a number of institutions that reflect, I think, the kind of values we all care about. And so I will be contributing in various parts the prize monies that have been received to the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, founded by Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said, to the Parents' Circle of Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families for peace, to the Lviv Lemberg Center for International Law, to the Chagos Refugees Group, and to the Botschafter des sozialen Zusammenhalts here in Vienna, as a way of expressing my solidarity with the work of each of these organizations. And I should say, just to conclude, I always go back to an Austrian writer, one whose book, The World of Yesterday, I find myself giving to so many people to try to understand what it means to find yourself in a situation of adversity. As you know, the book was published posthumously after Zweig had committed suicide. There's one passage in particular that I think about in that book right now, and I apologize that I'm not reading it in its original German, but in its very fine English translation. Zweig wrote, "For almost half a century, I trained my heart to beat as the heart of a citizen of the world. On the day I lost my Austrian passport, I discovered that when you lose your native land, you are losing more than a patch of territory set within borders. 85 years ago, my family, on my mother's side, lost its native land, and it lost much more than a patch of territory within set borders. What I've learned, and what I write about, is that patch never quite goes away. It remains. It's in our heart, it's in our soul, it's in our being. And for that reason, I express my deep gratitude to the Österreichischen Buchhandels for this award and this honor. Thank you so much.
Es folgt nun ein weiteres Stück des Duo Sonoma. Es folgt nun ein Gespräch, das Philippe Sands mit Rosie Goldsmith führen wird. Rosie ist britische Multimedia-Journalistin, hat weltweit für das BBC-Radio gearbeitet und leitet heute das European Literature Network. Wir wechseln jetzt unsere Sitzposition. Bitte, Rosie Goldsmith.
First of all, I can't tell you how proud I am that I'm able to do this with Philippe, who is somebody I've known for many, many years, as a colleague, as a friend. And I've been incredibly moved by all the words that everybody has been speaking today and by that extraordinary music. I mean, my goodness.
I want to just thank and join you. The music really is extraordinary. At this difficult moment in the world, music really is important. I think we've all understood it takes us to a different place.
Now, we've got a few minutes to talk about you. The spotlight is completely on you today, and I'm very proud that I can join these words and finally tell you how grateful I am as well for the work you've done. Now, Philippe, before you wrote East West Street and The Last Colony and The Rat Line, you'd written 17 books of legal academic books, and then you wrote these books where for the first time you were putting yourself in the picture. And I wonder what kind of shift it needed, because you were, for many, many, many years, decades, you were primarily a lawyer and an academic. And then here you were at the center of the story.
Well, I'm very proud of those books, even though they only sold between them 11 copies. They're my academic life, and they are the foundations of everything that came later, both as an academic but also as a practitioner. You spend hours and hours in court, sitting, watching, observing, often not speaking, listening, but just observing tiny points of detail. So Laudatio mentioned the attachment to detail, and I think that comes from just sitting in places and just watching how people react to what is said, and tiny points of detail, a stained glass window, which I've sat before at the International Court of Justice for years, thinking, why is that little piece there that particular color? How did that individual decide to make it that color rather than another color? So the change came as a result, really, of events in the world. I think you could almost say probably the events of September the 11th catalyzed me into wanting to find a bigger audience, not just writing for my community that I care about and love, of academics, of lawyers, but to talk about the issues that I care about in ways that reach a broader audience. And in the hands of a remarkable editor in New York, Victoria Wilson, at the publishing house Alfred Knopf, she was the one who really said to me, you're going to have to do what you've never done. You're going to have to put yourself into the story. And for those of you here who are lawyers or academics, you'll understand that's counterintuitive. You don't do that. Judges don't want to know what you think. They don't want to know what your role is in a particular story. And that was why East West Street took about 7 years to write and went through 5 different drafts, each of 150,000 words, each different, because Vicky had to pull out of me a willingness to speak about myself and insert myself in the story. It was her doing. I'm intensely grateful to her for having done that, but it was really tough.
And you've continued to do that with a few more, and you've got another real hot potato of a book awaiting us, which will be even more extraordinary, I think, if that's possible. Maybe you'll talk about that later. But the fact that you had been reluctant so far, and there you were not just using the terms genocide and crimes against humanity. These were actually crimes that had happened to your family, and you were meeting people who had either carried out crimes, been associated with them. But you still, I think, managed to retain a lot of reserve and restraint. And I wonder how difficult that was for you.
To be honest, it wasn't difficult at all, because one of the things that you do, so I've litigated a lot of cases about terrible things over the years. I've seen a lot of mass graves, I've seen quite a few bodies, and you somehow learn to detach yourself and step back and observe what's going on. There's a lot of emotion, and there's a lot of emotion in these books, but you don't wear it on your sleeve. And you learn to try to step out of yourself and watch what is going on. And I think what these 3 books have done, and I realize it only now looking back on them rather than in the writing of them, is to adopt a slight, I'm involved and I'm inserted, but I stand back and I try to be very understanding of the perspective of every different person. Now, my life is a legal life, but I married into a highly literary family. My wife's grandfather was the founder of the Édition de la Pléiade in France. Her father, my father-in-law, was the publisher at Pantheon. And so I entered into a family in which literature and words and the quality of writing were deeply valued. And I think what I've had the good fortune of having had happen is have these sort of 2 worlds come together and meld themselves by these forces.
And as a lawyer, of course, you know the power of the comma and the semicolon and how much it matters. I mean, you are, I know that when you were writing East West Street, you didn't realize what an extraordinary book this was going to be, and how could you have done in a way. It has taken on a life of its own. It's been translated into over 30 languages, I believe, and there are more languages to come. What do you make of that extraordinary explosion of interest?
So you've got to go back to 2010. I'm carrying on my regular life. Out of the blue comes an invitation from a place called Lviv. I don't, frankly, know where Lviv is.
At that time?
At that time. Today, everybody knows where Lviv is. But, come and give a lecture on the cases you do about crimes against humanity and genocide. Come to our university. I look up Lviv. Oh, Lviv is also Lvov, Leopolis, and it's Lemberg. Lemberg. My grandfather was born in Lemberg. That's interesting. He never talked about it. I knew him until, I was 38 years old. He died in 1997, so I knew him very well. He never once talked about his childhood in Lemberg, growing up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I thought, well, I'll go. I don't really want to give a lecture. That's not really, I'll give a lecture. But I want to find the house where he was born. Why? Because I want to know who he was. And I want to know who he was because I want to know who I am. To understand my grandfather is to understand myself. And that opened a door by unbelievable coincidence, and I really can't take any credit for it because I wasn't looking for it. I go to Lemberg to give a lecture on my cases on crimes against humanity and genocide, and I discover first that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity came from Lemberg, Hirsch Lauterpacht, and then that the man who invented the concept of genocide came from Lemberg, Raphael Lemkin. So I turn up in this city in Ukraine and say, well, actually, the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide are right here, not only in this town, in this very university, in this very law faculty. It was sort of a miracle. So then I had to write a book that became more complicated. A book about my grandfather and a book about the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity, and becomes the story of 4 men, Leon, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, and then Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's lawyer, whose son was marvelous in also opening up. But it was really complex, as we were discussing before, because you've got 2 stories going in parallel that are sort of connected, but not directly connected. And I remember at one point I said to my wonderful agent that this is just too difficult. I've got a brilliant idea. Let's write 2 books. Book number 1 will be about my grandfather, and book number 2 will be about the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. And she said, no. What's different about this book is that you meld the 2 together. It's complex, really complex to write, but under a great editor, Vicky Wilson, we managed to do it. But I had no idea what was going to happen. I remember at one time I said to my agent, Jill Coleridge, this is so boring, Jill. Who cares about my grandfather? Like, who's going to read this book? And she said, you will wait and see. People are interested. And she was right.
Now, we know about the impact of your book on the rest of the world and on us. What about the impact on your family? Because as you said, your family didn't talk about these issues, and your mother didn't. Your mother is French, your father is English, you're Franco-British. And you have now, very openly, shown your family history. How did they react?
Well, I mean, my mother's Austrian. You know, my mother was born in Vienna in July 1938, and she only spent a year here and then was transported to France by this remarkable lady, Elsie Tilney, and hidden in various families, various Catholic families, for 4 years and survived the war, as did her parents. But no one ever wanted to talk about it. And one of the things I've come to understand is that on both sides of these stories, and there are many sides, of course, but on the so-called victim side, the so-called perpetrator side, there's a sort of conspiracy of silence for different reasons and for complex reasons. So writing about it was difficult. When I got the invitation to go to Lviv, I said to my mother, I'm going to go to Lviv, Lemberg. Do we have any documents? I was 50 years old and I'd seen nothing. Can you imagine that? Nothing. And she says, yeah, I've got a few documents. So she went into her bedroom and came back with two plastic bags, and she put them on the floor, and I spent hours just these incredible documents from Lemberg, you know, his birth certificate and the house where they lived and all of these things. No one had ever talked about this. I got involved in the research, and it's delicate. And one has to be very respectful on both sides of the stories of things that are very painful for people who have no responsibility for what happened, but who live with the burden of history on all the different sides of the story. So at each stage, I tried to be very respectful and courteous of people's different situations. The upshot, of course, is that what has been a story in complete silence within our family has now been a story of, it's entered the public domain. A lot of people know about it. And I think what has been interesting, most interesting, apropos the effect on the family, is that, for example, in relation to my grandfather, who was an extraordinary man, he was a very impecunious man, very dignified, very courteous, quite religious, who'd lost his entire family. I mean, it's really hard to imagine you lose everybody, 80 people in your family. It's almost impossible to understand what that means. And it has, I think, sort of elevated him into a position of dignity and respect. And for my mother, I think that's been a good thing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the poet-songwriter Leonard Cohen has a poem called Anthem. And in that poem, there is a single line that I often come back to. You're aware of it. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So even out of the darkest moments, it is sometimes possible to extract things that emerge that have a more positive light. And I think this has enabled my family, and my mother in particular, to live with a lighter step, to make things easier, that something came out of this awful story which had a slightly more positive element.
What about the impact on you, though? I mean, as you said, you reached the age of 50 and you didn't know most of this. And the books, all the books are in a way a process of discovery, of self-discovery as well. So what about the impact on you?
Really significant impact. I mean, first of all, I alluded to it in the words that I said. I engaged with my family's past. Sometimes that wasn't so easy. Sometimes there were painful things to find out and difficult things to find out. I mean, the two ladies that I mentioned, Amalia and Herta, of course, I'd sort of barely even heard of them. I'm often asked, what's my greatest regret in my relations with my grandfather? And my greatest regret in relation to my grandfather is that I never said to my grandfather, who I loved deeply, he was a wonderful man, I never said to him, what was your mother like? And the reason that I never said that was because growing up as children, we knew that it was so painful that you just didn't open that door. So what's happened to me is that all of a sudden I've come to know these people. I know their names, I've seen pictures of them, I'm able to identify their life stories. They were real, living, sentient human beings, and that has filled out their past. And in filling out their past, I have a better sense of my own identity, including my Austrian identity, which I knew nothing really about, except, our family came from Austria, but I didn't know anything about it. And that, I think, is a good thing. I think it's been very positive for me.
What about your Jewish identity? Because, again, for a long time, you hadn't, you'd actually been reluctant to, in public, talk about your Jewish identity. I remember there was an interview you gave round about the time that the East-West Street came out, that you wanted to be known just as Philippe Sands, not as Jewish, not as French, not as Londoner, not as whatever, but not Jewish. And now, have you embraced being Jewish, and what does it mean for you?
Well, I grew up in a Jewish household. My grandfather was pretty religious, and he would take us off, I remember in Paris when we were kids, to synagogue, and it was awful and it was boring, and why are we doing this? But it made him happy, and so that was the reason that you did it. I had a bar mitzvah, but I'm not a religious person. I think I'm quite a spiritual person, but I'm not really a religious person, but I'm definitely Jewish. And I think what had happened was that, in a sense, because of what had happened in the past, one kept that part of one's identity not under wraps, I was open about it, but you didn't shout it from the rooftops. Engaging in this research and engaging in this story and allowing myself to go back to Lemberg in the 1900s, to Vienna in the 1920s and the 1930s, and my grandfather loved Vienna, just loved Vienna, has enabled me to understand what happened and enabled me to understand my own roots and my own identity. And I think the single most important moment is the moment in which Rückkehr nach Lemberg ends. There is this tension in the ideas of Lauterpacht and Lemkin. Lauterpacht believed that international law must protect the human being by focusing on the individual. And Lauterpacht's theory was that every individual human being has rights, human rights, as an individual. Lemkin said no. That's not why people get killed. People don't get killed because of what they have done individually. They get killed because they happen to be a member of a group that is hated at a particular moment in time or place. So if you want to protect human beings, protect the group. No, says Lauterpacht. If you go that route, you will replace the tyranny of the state with the tyranny of the group. And I think actually that is sort of what's happened in our times. So I'm intellectually 100% with Lauterpacht. Focus on the individual, not on the group. But I find myself in the small town of Żółkiew, Żółkwa today in Ukraine, just outside Lemberg, Lviv, and there is a mass grave. 3,500 people, including Hersch Lauterpacht's family, including my grandfather's family. They're there in the ground in a watery thing, unmarked, unrecognized, unanything. and they are there because they happen to be Jews. And I have to say, standing there at that moment, and we all understand this relationship between the individual and the group, who we are, how we identify ourselves, how we want the law to protect us as an individual or as a group. At that moment, I understood what Lemkin was doing. I'm troubled by Lemkin's idea, but each of us has a sense of connection with one or more groups. And Lemkin articulates that, and the law articulates that, and that's a roundabout way of saying that at that moment, part of my identity is my Jewishness, and that part of my identity, I wouldn't say it dominates, but I'm more engaged and embracing of it than I was before I started this journey.
Everybody today has spoken about how difficult the world is currently. I'm sure the world has been difficult for a very long time, but it is especially hard now. You are, as a lawyer, as a human being, very careful to be very balanced on both sides. I'm thinking particularly of Israel and Gaza at the moment. How do you assess the current awfulness of the world? Because it is awful. And how are you dealing with it?
I'd say on a scale of 0 to 10, it is about 9.8 on a scale of awfulness. Pretty bad. So the events of the 7th of October were very triggering for me because, very frankly, it sort of the images that we started to see in our newspapers looked a lot like the kinds of things Lemkin and Laudatio talked and wrote about, pogroms in Russia kind of thing, or sort of Einsatzgruppen going into a Polish village and killing everybody. And that was, oh my God, this is happening. And it's happening again, and it's happening in our lifetimes. But of course, then came the response, and the response troubles me greatly in terms of the civilian loss of life and children's loss of life. 8 of us came together, 8 British Jewish lawyers, and we published a piece in the Financial Times newspaper. We made 3 points, and it was very early, so it was somewhat, I don't think it was controversial, but some people reacted positively, some people reacted negatively. 1, what happened on the 7th of October was a crime. It was an atrocity. Justice must be done. 2, we expressed the view that Israel had a right to self-defense in order to protect itself from such things. But, and it's a big but, 3, that right of self-defense is not unlimited and must operate within the law, including obligations of restraint and proportionality and distinguishing between civilian targets and military targets, Hamas. So that was the only thing that I articulated publicly. Normally, and I've had hundreds of interview requests, the reason that I have not responded to any of those requests for interviews is that right now, and it dates back to well before these events, it's been for a year and a half, one of the cases that I'm doing as a lawyer is the case for Palestine at the International Court of Justice on the right of self-determination of Palestine. A request of the General Assembly of the United Nations. It follows on from the Chagos case, which is about self-determination. And I have no problem doing that case because I think Palestine does have a right of self-determination. And to go to the International Court of Justice is to follow the path of law and the rule of law. And I'm entirely comfortable being associated with that. But we have a rule as barristers in England, which is when you're involved in a case, you don't comment publicly on the kinds of issues that arise. And so for that reason, I've just been completely restrained. I have strong views about things, but I don't express them.
When we look at international law today, and we look at, there are 4 crimes against international war crimes, so to speak, but there is, you look at the crime of genocide, for instance. The fact that there is a recognized law against genocide does not mean it's not happening again. So what does it do if we are in some regards ignoring international law and international organizations such as the UN are perceived as being weak in speech marks? Where does that leave you? Where does that leave international law?
So when I was a young academic in the 1980s, or I should say an even younger academic in the 1980s, doing my stuff on international law, I had a colleague at the college that I was at, St. Catherine's College, He was a professor of English legal history, a wonderful man called Sir John Baker, and he worked on English legal history. And he would sometimes invite me for lunch and say, oh, what are you working on, Philippe? And I would tell him what I was working on, you know, actually with Elie Lauterpacht, the son of Hirsch Lauterpacht, although we didn't know our connections.
Another extraordinary coincidence.
Extraordinary coincidence that Elie and I knew each other. Elie gave me my first job in 1984, and it was only in 2014 that I discovered that his father and my great-grandmother were born and lived on the same street in Żółkiew, the book that Joseph Roth called East-West Street, Lemberger Straße in Żółkiew. So the context of, you know, doing that kind of work, I'd be hauled in by John Baker, what are you working on? And I'd say this, that, and the other. And he'd say, oh, yes, yes, yes. We had a similar problem in English law in 1472. And it took 275 years to sort it out. And international law is like that. You know, in 1945, we created these new ideas, genocide, crimes against humanity, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to be sorted out in 10 years, in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. It's a long game. And even if right now one can feel a little bit pessimistic about what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, over the longer term, the ideas are there. And once the ideas are set, they don't go away. They have a life of their own, and they work their magic over generations. And one can permit oneself to feel more optimistic for the younger people in the audience when you look forward much longer in time. What happened in 45 was a totally revolutionary moment, and it will take generations for it to have its effects. And in that way, I think one can understand it's part of a trajectory and a longer journey in which there are going to be some terrible bumps on the road.
What about you've been for many decades working on the possibility of making ecocide an international crime. How far have you got? I mean, you were there before any of us were, you know, thinking about the climate crisis and how central it is now, critical to our lives today. And I'm just wondering how far you've got.
Well, in a curious way, and it's very consistent with the themes of this year's European Literature Days. My start in life, really, as a lawyer and as an academic, was in the field of the environment. The single most significant incident for me, the start of everything, was what happened on the 26th of April 1986, the accident at Chernobyl, which caused me to be asked to write a paper for a conference in Washington, D.C., to start to explore a subject that did not exist in the 80s, international environmental law, which is the subject of my first book on Chernobyl, and then subsequent textbooks on international environmental law. And 3 years ago, the work that I did on crimes against humanity and genocide and on the environment caused me to be invited by an NGO to co-chair a working group to come up with a definition of a fifth international crime. We've got war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, the crime of aggression. They all protect the human. The gap in the international legal order is there's no international crime to protect the environment. And that's what ecocide was about. It actually goes back to 1972, Olof Palme, and a wonderful British lawyer called Polly Higgins, who drove the thing forward. Sadly, she passed away. And it was left to me and colleagues to come up with a definition of this thing. But it's a very significant moment because on Friday, the European Union agreed to adopt new legislation on criminal liability for environmental harm, which was comparable to ecocide. And so the issue now, I think, is not whether the concept of damage to the environment becomes part of the international criminal legal order, but how and when it's happening. And again, for the young people in the audience, it will be your generation that will take this thing forward.
Oh, congratulations. I didn't know it had got so far. That's
Yeah,
really
Friday was a big
wonderful,
day.
wonderful news.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of people here who, because we've been talking about animals and humans and whether there could be greater equality. What about an international law to protect animals?
Well, I think that it is coming. I mean, when I studied the law for the first time in the 1980s, there was no courses on environment or animals or biodiversity or nature. It didn't exist. And the change came in the 1990s, actually, in my world, in a series of decisions at the International Court of Justice. And literature, as with so many things, has played a singularly important role. One of the experiences that I've had, I mean, we're here for European Literature Days, so let me put the accent on something. Ideas really matter. Ideas in our lives are expressed through words, either spoken or on the printed page or on the computer. And those words take on a life of their own. And someone reads something and they think, oh, that's an interesting idea. I'll see what I can do with that. And the next thing that happens is you're moving towards policies or legal rules or decisions taken by courts. And what we are seeing is this sort of influence of ideas and words and literature and books and radio programs and TV programs and things essentially and eventually translating into action. And we see that in relation to nature, biodiversity, and animals, which are part of our agenda, my agenda today, in a legal and literary sense, very, very clearly. So something is happening, plainly.
I'm glad you brought it back to literature. Literature is everything for us. In fact, we met the very first time at a literature festival in the UK, at the Hay Festival. And I wanted to end the interview with your anecdote about John le Carré, because John le Carré has written wonderful blurbs for your books. He's been a great supporter. And of course, I know that you were also a great friend of John le Carré's. And of course, in a way, you're similar. Lawyers are like detectives, and I can imagine you and he had a lot in common. He passed away, as you know, last year.
3 years ago, 2.5 years ago.
Gosh, that long already.
Yeah.
But he lives on, and you knew him really well. So tell us briefly about him.
Yeah, well, I've been very lucky in life in many ways. And I've described a little bit the fortune of falling in love with someone who's part of the literary world, which caused me to up my game.
That's your wife, not John le Carré.
My wife. No, I didn't marry.
Did you fall in love?
I didn't marry John le Carré. I sort of fell in love with him a bit, I suppose. He is,
Lots of women
his voice is incredible. If you're interested in hearing his voice, go onto the BBC, just type in the Ratline podcast and listen to episode 6, because I interview him in episode 6 of the Ratline. You can hear his magical, incredible voice. But the thing was that I had the great fortune, he was my neighbor. And I met him in our local pub around the time of the Iraq War. I'd seen him in the pub. I had no idea who he was. And then it was Robert McCrum. Once I went to have lunch in the pub with Robert McCrum, who editor of the Observer, literary editor of the Observer newspaper. And Robert went and talked to this man with white hair and his wife. And then we went and sat down, and I said to Robert, "Who is that person?" And Robert said, "You don't know who that is?" I said, "No." I said, "I see him in the pub the whole time, but I don't know who he is." He says, "That's John le Carré, David Cornwell." I said, "Oh, okay." On the way out, we started talking about the Iraq War. And then he said, "Come and have lunch with me." And when John le Carré says, "Come and have lunch with you," you go and have lunch with him. And one thing led to another. We became very close friends. And for the last 20 years of his life, my job was to review one part of every manuscript he wrote. So he would turn up, he'd ring the doorbell, open the door, and he'd be standing there with his printed on his cheap home printer, his latest manuscript. And he would say, usual procedure, which you know from that film about that is always played on New Year's Eve. He's got a great sense of humor. He loved the German language. And I'd say, okay, usual procedure. And the usual procedure was, for those of you who've read John le Carré, he despises lawyers. Every single le Carré novel has a completely disgusting lawyer in it. Read le Carré again, you will see what I mean. My job was to check that the le Carré disgusting lawyer spoke like a lawyer, dressed like a lawyer, and he would give me the manuscript and say usual procedure, and he didn't put a little sticky note down, so I had to read the whole bloody thing to find the 3 lines in it at page 275 where he described a disgusting lawyer. And we would then have the most surreal conversations in the pub. I'd say, David, no lawyer calls, he had, in one of the last novels, he had the lawyer describing the client, calling the client heart. Literally heart. I just said, David, no lawyer calls their client heart. He said, yes, they do, I've heard them. And I'd say, no, it's ridiculous. You've got to change that. Say love or darling, but not heart. He did change it. He did change the novel. Anyway, the upshot was, I had to read every single novel from beginning to end. And that has a big impact on my writing because I learned from him various techniques. It's not so much plagiarism as just he would say, this is how I do it. When you read le Carré and when you read Sands, notice the technique. In the first pages, there is a tiny point of detail that seems totally irrelevant. It's there for a reason. And the reason le Carré would say is readers are very intelligent people. And they read you with a double brain. Firstly, there's a part of the brain that is just reading the story that you're telling. And then there is another part of the brain which is trying to be very clever and to work out where you, the author, are taking them in order to get to the conclusion before you unveil the conclusion. And so he explained that to me. I thought, yeah, that's really good. And people have often asked me, how are you able to write books about these boring issues of international law which make people want to carry on reading? And it's the le Carré technique. It's plainly taken from le Carré. So for example, in Die Rattenlinie, you might ask yourself, why does Sands suddenly talk about this guy who liked to go swimming in page 8, right at the beginning? Wächter loved to swim. And of course, those of you who've read Die Rattenlinie know exactly why that is there. I'm not going to tell you why. I think the thing that is interesting for me about the journey that I've taken is this interweaving of literature and law and how the two come together. They have a close relationship. And in the next book that's coming, which is the third, I mean, Last Colony is a separate direction, but the third book is a sequel to Die Rattenlinie. You start with East-West Street. The main character is, one of the main characters is Hans Frank. He has a mate called Otto Wächter. Otto Wächter becomes the main character in Die Rattenlinie. In Die Rattenlinie, if those of you who've read it attentively will remember, there is a tiny character called Walter Rauff. Who is Walter Rauff? Walter Rauff is a friend of Otto Wächter's. He is also the inventor of the mobile gas vans in which they killed people before they had the large camps. So Walter Rauff becomes the main character in the third and final part of the trilogy. What happens to Walter Rauff? Unlike Otto Wächter, and they lived in the same monastery room in Rome, and they were friends, and there is a letter in the Wächter archive from Rauff, which is the start of this book. Rauff does escape. He goes to Syria. He lives in Damascus for a year. He writes to Wächter and says, don't come to Damascus, terrible place for us Germans. They don't do things efficiently. Go to South America. Ralph leaves Syria, goes back to Italy, becomes an agent of the new Israeli government, almost unbelievably, having been indicted for mass murder, like Wächter, and then goes with his wife and 2 children to Ecuador and begins a new life in the city of Quito, where the inventor of the mobile gas vans becomes a motor mechanic for Mercedes-Benz. Couldn't invent it.
I'd say you couldn't make it up.
You couldn't make it up. He then meets a wonderful, he and his wife Edith meet a wonderful couple in Quito who were associated with the Chilean embassy in Quito, and the Chileans say, you're in the wrong country. You shouldn't be in Ecuador, you should be in Chile. We like people like you in Chile. He goes to Chile, he becomes the manager of a king crab cannery in Punta Arenas in southern Chile, the southernmost town in the whole world, safe from being caught. He successfully resists an extradition request in 63 to be sent back to West Germany to face trial for mass murder for the gas fans, goes back to Punta Arenas in Patagonia, features later on as a character in the works of Roberto Bolaño, 2 books, and Bruce Chatwin in Patagonia, which many of you will have read, unbelievably. And then, miracle of miracles, on September the 11th, 1973, his friend from Quito, Ecuador, becomes president of Chile, because his friend is Augusto Pinochet. And Pinochet says to him, I need you. I need your help. And the book tells the story of what happened after that. So you couldn't invent it. You know, these 2 different parts of history coming together, which of course then land on my desk in London on the 29th of October 1998, when Pinochet's lawyers call me and invite me to act as Pinochet's lawyers when he's arrested in London and to argue that he has immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts. That happens to be the day of my grandfather's burial ceremony in Paris. I go to the cemetery, I arrive, my wife has traveled by separate means. I say to her, frankly, with some excitement, guess what? The Pinochet lawyers have been in touch. They want me to act for Pinochet. We have a rule at the English bar called the taxi driver principle. You're like a taxi driver. Someone says, stop, I want to take you. You can't say, I don't like that person. You have to act for everybody, even those kinds of people. So I say to my wife, ooh, quite exciting, I'm going to be in the Pinochet case in London. She says, really, are you going to do it? I said, well, you know the taxi rank rule. And she says, well, you can do it, but if you do it, I'll divorce you. And that's where the story begins.
And I'm not going to let you describe what happens next.
I'm not going to tell you what happens next. You have to buy the book.
You have to buy it. And when will that book be?
May 2025. And published simultaneously in English, German, and Spanish.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, you heard it here first.
Yeah.
What an amazing story. Philippe, you are one of the world's greatest storytellers. You really are. And I'm going to have to stop you, though, because we have to finish this extraordinary event. Thank you so much, Philippe, for your generosity, your charm, your wit, your humor, and for all you've done for all of us, legally and on every other level. Thank you so much,
Rosie.
Philippe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
One more
stay
treat,
here?
music.
Okay. Thank you.
Look at that. Dear friends, we have one more treat for all of you and for Philippe to say thank you, the extraordinary duo Sonoma. Thank you to both of them. Are they so taken aback that they decided not to play again? I hope they're still here. Amazing.
Mir bleibt noch, mich bei Ihnen allen für Ihr Kommen und Ihre Aufmerksamkeit zu bedanken. Bleiben Sie noch bei uns. Der Bürgermeister der Stadt Krems ladet Sie zu einem Glas Wein ein. Wird draußen im Kreuzgang serviert. Ich wünsche Ihnen noch anregende Gespräche und eine gute Heimreise. Auf Wiedersehen.